Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my friend who's going to tell us how he pronounces his wonderful name.
Christian Shurko, or if you just want to say Christian Zurko, just don't call me late for dinner.
Okay, we won't. And we decided that we'd talk about one of the 8 deadly sins of thought reform, as they're now being called, which Robert J. Lifton ushered upon the world in 1961 in his groundbreaking book, which I've got a copy of somewhere. There it is, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And we're going to talk about the concept of dispensing of existence. So would you like to kick us off, Christian?
Sure. To me, the thing that brought this to my mind again is that it's been a recurrent theme in the world of abusive groups that there comes a point where deciding who's fit to live and who isn't fit to live goes from metaphor to reality. So you have Jim Jones not just practicing white knights, but actually making people drink the poison. And, we've had the...
Heaven's Gate, Order of the Solar Temple.
Heaven's Gate and...
Aum Shinrikyo.
Yeah, it just goes on. And of course, there are question marks over other groups because nothing's ever been proven. But you have one person here and one person there and one person here who suddenly decides that they're going to commit suicide in some very unusual way, perhaps using a rifle that's longer than their arms to shoot themselves with, or something like this.
Susan Meissner on Ron Hubbard's ship. Yeah. I mean, the very high rate of suicide in Scientology, because they bolster their membership numbers, people don't realize that they actually, I worked out they have 10 times the average suicide rate when I got to numbers in 1993.
Right.
And I don't think it's changed any.
And suicide is a problem there because I have on more than one occasion had an ex-member tell me that they were told at some point that they were such failures that they would be better off dead.
And they were degraded beings. And they had to drop the body so that they could... and in Aum Shinrikyo, it was the notion of power, that you were committing a humanitarian act by murdering somebody because it was ridding them of their bad karma so they could be reborn as a ninth earwig or something. I don't know what's high up on the chain, according to Aum Shinrikyo.
Yeah.
So Sahara will have been reborn by now, of course.
Well, as what, though?
An earwig, I should think. It's more than it deserves, frankly.
And, of course, politics lately has, and the way politics has become authoritarian, and more supposed politicians have become more like personality cults or... Yeah. Personality masters in some way. And the way that this has meant that governments are now treating not just foreigners, but their own citizens as expendable. We talk about the Beijing government in, 1989 in Tiananmen Square. But it's not the only place where that's happened. And it's not necessarily even the highest numbers, unless you also want to talk about Beijing's treatment of prisoners, of the Falun Gong prisoners, which is a controversial subject, I know, for some people. Because
or of the Uyghur.
Gong and the Uyghur, and, you start looking at this, and they are dispensing the right to exist, or in some cases, the right to stop existing. And we're now seeing governments take on this same role of saying, we'll decide if you're fit or if you're not fit. And if you're not fit, well, it's not just a metaphor. We're going to get rid of you.
Which we saw in the eugenics program started by Galton in the UK here in the 19th century, but there were sterilization programs in, say, California and Sweden and India in the 1970s under Indira Gandhi. And, of course, the famous T4 program in Nazi Germany, where perhaps as many as 200,000 people were killed by their own doctors or, people who had taken the Hippocratic oath to do no harm because they were seen as non-human.
Yeah.
If you look back into US history, I checked the date yesterday, actually, because I was talking about it. In 1876, after a case had been won against the US government by the Ponca people, allowing them to return home because there was no reason for them to be on a reservation. It was declared in Congress that they were not actually human beings, the native people. And it was not until 1924 that it was decided they were. But even then, they had the rights of children.
Yeah.
It's just incredible to write off a whole population. And certainly with slavery, the idea that black people were in some way a different species, which we still hear from identity Christians talking about mud people and this sort of nonsense. Mm-hmm. That the evidence, I'm afraid, is against all such assertions. We're all black. Some of us are just slightly lighter in color than others, but we're all black. We're all descended from the same place and the same people. But this idea of separating out, which then turns other people into a target, an animal, vermin, something to be destroyed.
Yeah.
It's the final point of Lifton's in Margaret Singer's analysis. It's the last point of the 8 points, that now we are superior to you and we can decide what happens to your life.
Yeah. And even in so-called free societies now, we have a more or less subtle idea that people are negotiable as to the value of their lives. There was all that business over herd immunity, which is a way of saying, let the disease cull out the people who are the least able to protect themselves from the disease.
And with no idea of what the disease would do, there's 65 to 70% of the population need to have caught it. And of course, if you were talking about, say, Ebola, then that might kill 90% of the people who got it. So until you know what the disease is and what it will do and the numbers, it is rashly insane. I mean, my hero, Dominic Cummings, who's here behind me with his little fishing pole, controlling Boris Johnson, taking back control of Boris Johnson. It is said that he was the one who introduced this idea to government. He denies it. But let's face it, in his job, denial is a basic principle.
Yeah. So there's things like that. And of course, even in the United States, which prides itself, probably not with cause, but prides itself on being the champion of the weak, looking at the way the federal troops treat even peaceful demonstrators. And are there demonstrators who are behaving badly? Yes, there are. Are they protesting police who behave themselves badly? Oh, yes, they are. And and then you have the question of how this all started, which is the idea that you can arrest a person who's not actually doing anything worthy of arrest, and you can kneel on his neck for nearly 8 minutes and until he stops breathing, and that's okay. And as I think it was Chris Rock said, that there are some professions where it's okay to have a bad apple. Policing isn't one of them.
No.
You wouldn't like it if I think he used American Airlines as the example. We wouldn't like it if American Airlines made a statement to the effect that most of our pilots are okay, just the occasional one who likes to fly into the ground. Mm-hmm. And I think policing is very much the same. I think he's right about that.
We named a campaign Cops Integrity Matters, which we launched a week or so back, because that needs to go alongside Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
To say also that those, police officers regularly perform heroic acts.
Yeah.
And they should be better acknowledged for that.
Yes.
But those cops who actually, have developed herd immunity, so they've become part of the herd, and they have a loyalty to their fellow officers over and above their loyalty to the people and the law, are in fact criminals and very dangerous to society. And the ethos is appalling, and we've seen it generation upon generation in the police.
Yeah. I was disturbed, as disturbed as I was by the policeman who actually murdered. I was disturbed by the two who stood by and just watched and made sure nobody interfered.
Yep.
And all the other ones who stood across the street, and not one of them spoke up.
No.
I found that, so that we're talking not simply about what we would identify as a cult group or an extremist authoritarian sect or whatever other name we want to give it. In the most formal sense, we're talking about a kind of tribalism, which can even be an informal tribalism, creating this sense that when we are gathered together, we have the right to decide who lives and who dies.
And it extends into the professions. I mean, I've had quite some dealings with trying to complain about medical malpractice, and again about legal malpractice, and the malpractice definitely happened. I have no doubt of that.
Yeah.
But the situation is that people will cover up for members of their fellow members of their profession. So, the Law Society will make sure that lawyers, nothing happens to them. There was this peculiar thing that we do have an independent police inquiry commission or board, IPCC, in fact, whatever that stands for, IPCA. And they actually, I think it was New Labour who decided that minor complaints would be handled by the police. And I complained about something that were actually named 3 people who had invaded my house with machetes, and the police didn't bother to investigate further. And I made complaints, and I was told that there was nowhere I could go because under the new system, you can't refer on to the IPCC. So I was saying, so there are armed robbers abroad. I've told you the names of these people. I found out who they were. Quite by chance, I found out who they were. And you're not interested. And you don't have to do anything about it. And I was treated very churlishly. And and again, with doctors who've done something wrong, it is, as you say, tribalism that we have to honor whistleblowers. When was it the movie The Insider with Russell Crowe in about, or his name escapes me, Jeffrey somebody or other, who basically blew the whistle on the tobacco industry, and he released thousands of documents showing that I think they call them the 7 dwarves, the heads of the 7 major. Liggett and Myers and Browns and British American, what have you, they'd all sworn under oath that they did not believe that nicotine was addictive. And he proved, beyond any slightest shadow of a doubt, that Jeffrey Wigand, they knew very well, because they talked about nicotine delivery systems and how to make children, teenagers, more rapidly addicted to their product. The problem is his life was ruined and destroyed because he stood up against them. And having been a whistleblower and having had something similar happen to me, our society is just the wrong way around. People who are ethical and stand up against the wrongs of society should be applauded. In fact, I should be given a life pension. There should be statues of me instead of people who are in the slave trade. That's possibly going a little bit too far, but they would be covered in gold, and put outside Trump Towers, no doubt. We've got it all the wrong way around, that our loyalty must be to humanity. Our loyalty must be to being humanitarian and being pro-social, rather than some little bunch of thugs dressed in blue. Which is what's happened. That's a bit of a rant for you. You can pick up and say something sensible now, if you would.
Well, I was just reflecting. See, this whole thing came about because everywhere I've been looking lately, how you become aware of something, and then all of a sudden you realize how common it is.
How pervasive it is, yes.
Like the first time you notice a particular car that you've never seen before, and all of a sudden you realize everybody's driving one of those.
They're all driving Lamborghinis.
Well, no, not Lamborghinis.
Fords.
But I've realized how this is everywhere. And it's in so many different ways. Trump says that these protesters shouldn't be handled too gently. And they're not being handled gently. Or he says that somebody who's said something he didn't like in one of his rallies, throw them out and don't be nice to them. And they get beaten up and all this. And then he makes the comment, well, if you get in trouble, I'll take care of you. And
I could go out in the street and shoot somebody and nobody would care. And people can fall harder than they're pushed in his rules of gravity.
Yeah. Well, that's all part of this idea that one person can say something like that, people can act on it, and then he can say, nothing to do with me. And yet it is everything to do with him, because he has given people permission to behave that way.
Yeah.
And he's normalized that behavior.
So if somebody drives a car into a protester and kills
a lot of protesters,
then it's, there are two sides involved in this, and there's the guy driving the car and there's the person who's run down.
Yeah.
The person was maybe wearing an offensive T-shirt, so deserved to die. It's to get into the mentality of such a solipsistic, narcissistic human being who seems to have the intelligence of a bag of frozen peas is very difficult. And then you have apologists like Jordan Peterson. Let's have a go at him too, who just don't seem to have grown up. They don't seem to accept that we need to be pro-social. We need to help one another if we are to have what's called a society or civilization.
And then, because there's no definition of what it means to act this way, you eventually get people saying, well, he just hit that person with his car. I can actually shoot them.
Yeah, because I happen to be able to go and buy an AK-47 because I live in America.
Yeah. And
can I buy an atomic weapon?
And that is the very essence of the extremism that ultimately leads us to saying this person won't live anymore.
They don't deserve to live.
Yeah. It's just this way that people have in a tribal mentality, in a mob mentality, to say, well, that person's very zealous, so I've got to be more zealous. What we were talking about so glibly a few years back, when people were commentating on news clippings from North Korea, where one person would be on his hands and knees with his face on the ground weeping, so the person next to him would feel obliged to bang his head on the ground while he was weeping to prove that he was even more zealous, because the one thing you don't want to be is the least zealous person in the crowd.
Well, they had to give up laughter and drinking for 3 years after the last Kim died. I think it was 3 years.
I didn't actually keep track of it. So
no, it flew by, just flew by.
I suspect not for them.
And things become conventions, don't they? That
yeah.
So the abusive treatment of slaves just was normalized. So whenever people want to promote the notion of slavery, as Dylan Roof did before going and murdering 9 people, they need to read Thomas Thistlewood. Go and dig it up. Go and look at somebody who kept slaves, and he reports on the normal behavior. Go and look up what a Derby dump is. I'm certainly not going to explain it here because it's too horrific. Yeah. But it becomes normalized to behave in a savage manner.
And it becomes casual. It becomes as casual as what some people think of as swatting a fly.
Yeah.
Where their mind doesn't even shift from whatever they're doing. They just do this thing.
And there's no further responsibility. Looking at the way that napalm and Agent Orange were used in Vietnam, we're still seeing massive birth deformities as a consequence of Agent Orange. And no liability or responsibility has ever been taken for what must surely be one of the most severe war crimes in all history. At the moment, the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, are still using white phosphorus. It's absolutely against international conventions, biochemical warfare, but they will spray you with phosphorus, which will eat down to your bones and somehow justify that. And if you criticize them, you're anti-Semitic. But I'm pro-human, mate. I don't think you should be allowed to do that to children
or anybody else. We just have to change the way we are and decide that everybody has the right to live.
Yeah.
That being somebody I disagree with doesn't mean you lose your right to live.
Or should be called a reptard or a libtard.
Yeah, and even being a not so nice person, there are, it may be necessary to punish criminals. It is not necessary to take their lives.
I don't think it's necessary to punish them, because the word punishment means to cause pain. That's its root, as you doubtless know.
And frankly, we should have gotten past that by now.
It may be necessary to restrain them so they don't hurt us, but causing them harm, we've seen the consequences of that everywhere that you get massive reversion to crime from people who are hurt. We now have good evidence in the last 20 years that if you treat psychopaths well, they will do less damage. There's good statistical evidence to support this idea. And we're still struggling with, are they born or are they made? Or are the two things combined? And I think a lot of it's the two things combined. So you have pro-social sociopaths like James Fallon, who demonstrate that even if you're born with this stuff going on, you can actually contribute a great deal to society. Just don't go on holiday to Africa with him, like his brother, oh, here are the Marburg caves. And his brother had got home before he realized that's where Marburg Ebola came from, isn't it, Jim? It's like, oh, yeah. Just a bit of a joke, So you do have to watch him a bit, Jim Fallon, if he comes round, But he's done fantastic work in neuroscience and genetics.
Yeah.
But you treat people badly, you will definitely get a bad result. You treat people well, you will sometimes get a bad result, but not as often.
Yes, I was just reading recently a book that I first read back in the 1960s, which I found really challenged me and in many ways transformed me. It gave me a deeper look at the reality that as a teenager I didn't really see, because I didn't have to live with it. It was something that had been at a distance from me, and all of a sudden I found myself face to face with a reality that had only been a distant one, and that's a book called Black Like Me.
Yeah.
And if anybody out there has not read that book yet, find it, read it.
Ellison's Invisible Man.
What
it's like to be black in a white world.
Well, that's just it. This book is about a white journalist who decided it was time to get under, sorry about the pun, to get under the skin of racism. And he did, and it there were a couple of times when it nearly cost him his life. And it's not simply the hatred of black people, but the casual assumption that it's right to hate black people. And if you extend that, it's right to hate the other, whatever the other may be.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. And that realization, as a teenager, teenage boys, let's face it, teenage boys sometimes can be very casual and even flippant about their understanding of the world around them, because they're still boys. I can't speak.
Boys will be boys.
Can't speak for teenage girls, but I would imagine that they just struggle with similar issues in different ways, but maybe they still have them. I can speak for myself and for my friends, and I can say that there were things that we said to ourselves, it's not here. We don't have to worry about it. It's nothing to do with us. It's over there. And all of a sudden you realize, no, it's right here under your nose. And once you see it so graphically demonstrated, you suddenly realize it is everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's just so casual, and it is done in such a subtle but all pervasive way that it's like the air you breathe. You don't even notice it's happening anymore. And that same idea that it's perfectly okay. In the 1960s, in some states, it was perfectly okay to say, if you're not white, you can't use this toilet. You can't drink from that water fountain. You can't sit at these chairs and tables and order food. And if you try, you will be arrested.
Yeah, when Artie Shaw was touring the Southern States in the 1930s, he had Billie Holiday singing in his band, and he was told that she'd have to be on a separate stage. And being Artie Shaw, he said, "I'm going home."
Yeah.
And that
Which is what needed to happen a lot more and a lot sooner.
Yeah, I think Benny Goodman was the first to actually dare to go on stage with black musicians, Teddy Wilson playing the great Teddy Wilson playing piano for him. And they'd been making these recordings, which were really successful because Goodman was the biggest selling star of swing. And people didn't realize that all of the musicians, apart from Goodman, were black. And, then you get into some very confusing things. Duke Ellington wouldn't perform anything from Porgy and Bess, Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, which includes, of course, Summertime, the world's most popular song. Though Gershwin died before it became popular, the music actually flopped. But Ellington, the great Duke Ellington, would not perform it because he reckoned that it was racist that a white man had written a novel and then a white man had written a musical. And you then go, yes, they were Jewish white men. They know what it's like to be oppressed. We mustn't invert racism in any way. So Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, of course, did record beautiful versions of songs from Porgy and Bess. I love you, Porgy. But I think that's another point, that it's very important not to make yourself part of a tribe in any way, though standing up for the rights if the group to which you belong is oppressed. I mean, Jimi Hendrix, in an interview, somebody said something about your people. And he said, what do you mean, my people? And in his case, it was a bit more confusing because, as you know, he was an 8th Cherokee and he was an 8th Irish, which nobody ever mentions. They mention that he was Cherokee, but they don't mention the Irish part of him. Another oppressed people, particularly in this country.
I studied with a guy who, like Hendrix, was part American Indian, part Native American, and as well as being, I think he was I think I would be right in saying he was mostly Afro-American, but he also was of mixed background, and the amount of confusion that sowed for some people who just made assumptions about him. And being who he was, he didn't mind pulling them up and saying, what exactly are you talking about? Do you even know? And it was, I think it was good for us, but it was
and let's put a little historical note in here that the birth of the blues, in terms of the man who taught the world the blues, was a man called Charlie Patton. And we're not quite sure whether he was part Choctaw or part Cherokee, but, this is, we can't afford racism. That, the same with jazz, that there are as many Jewish contributors, almost, not as many, but outside of Cole Porter, just about every writer of jazz standards was Jewish. And Lieber and Stoller, of course, who wrote songs for Elvis Presley, were Jewish. And they were often black songs like Hound Dog that had been rewritten. And it's a melting pot, and it works best that way.
I think it's a really beautiful thing that when you get to something like music, the people who are inside that realize just how, or at least most of them do, just how pointless all these stupid little subdivisions really are. When you start out thinking, well, this is our music, or this is our style, or this is our this or that, and then you meet people from outside, what you would call others, and you realize they got it. They understand this. This is not yours, it's ours. And I've always enjoyed seeing how musicians are able to look past those divisions for the most part. And again, it's nothing's universal, unfortunately.
Wagner.
Well, yes, okay, we won't talk about him. But so many really fine musicians could get together and see past those divisions and say, we are all together in this.
Well, Louis Armstrong talking about Bix Beiderbecke.
Yes.
And saying, he was as good as I am, which is not true. Nobody's as good as Louis. But if you look in the arts, this notion of cultural appropriation, which is a great idea, and it's like, what isn't appropriated? So even if you look at, say, the Impressionists, the French Impressionists, they were very much influenced by ukiyo-e, the Japanese print form. These prints were coming over as wrapping for porcelain and stuff. And when you look to Van Gogh, who's post-impressionist, or Gauguin, who's post-impressionist, there you can see the direct influence. In fact, so much so that Van Gogh used reed pens, Japanese reed pens, to draw with. So you you discover something, you take it in. And again, with those early blues players, if you look at, say, Josh White, that in the morning he'd record as a singing Christian, and in the afternoon he'd record songs like Little Brother about how he liked stabbing people with his knife. That they moved, they went to where they could be paid, they could gain a living. So again, a lot of the early blues musicians, they'd play at juke joints, and at plantation parties, but on a Sunday they'd be playing at white picnics, and so they would play the songs, you know. And I working as a musician, we played the stuff the audience wanted to hear, you know, because that's what most musicians have to do. And you didn't care where it came from. So, say, Huddie Leadbelly, he's singing songs from everywhere. Blind Lemon, what's his name? Jefferson, Blind Lemon Jefferson. God, that flew away for a moment. He recorded songs that are blues, and he's one of the first. But he's also recording songs that are considered folk songs. And then when you start looking at Tennessee music and the bluegrass music, you start going, these people are playing with each other. They're playing the same tunes, you know, only maybe doing a bit of yodeling, which is how the bluegrass appropriated blues early on with Jimmy Rogers, not the Jimmy Rogers who played in Muddy Waters Band, but the one that went yodelay through his song. All of this movement is so healthy. The idea... I was in South Africa many years ago, and my host said to me it was such a terrible shame that the native people were losing their traditions, and I'd never thought about this. Mm-hmm. And it just popped into my head, well, does that mean I ought to be doing Morris dancing? You know, if you go to the Lakota people, the Sioux, as the French called them, the cutthroats, they still dance the ghost dance. They dance it for tourists, which I find a bit odd. But of course, that dance was something that was invented during the 1880s with the idea it would proof you against the bullets, and apparently it didn't. So, you know, culture changes, it moves along and it assimilates, and as long as it's respectful of tradition, as long as we understand I tell the story again and again. In Ken Burns Jazz, there's a white critic who says he grew up in the South being told that black people were inferior, that they were a different species, that they were more closely related to the apes than we are. And then one night he saw Louis Armstrong play and his whole world fell apart. He said, well, this is the first person I've seen who's actually a genius. So where does that put us white folks? Maybe it's the other way around, you know? Yeah. Maybe we've just got the whip hand at the moment and, you know, they're smarter than we are. But you know, I think now enough time has gone by and there have been enough people like, say, Langston Hughes or Toni Morrison, or just such a torrent of brilliant people to be able to say these are ridiculous ideas. The horror is that, I mean, New Scientist the other week ran a piece saying, actually, there is still massive prejudice in the sciences against people of Asian or African descent. That they aren't getting the jobs they should get. There's discrimination against women. There's, you know, gender apartheid, as it's being called now. And there's discrimination against people of different skin tones. And I'm absolutely with Martin Luther King that the content of people's character is a lot more important than what colour they happen to be. You know, I mean, I'm not really sure what colour I am. I'm certainly not white. It's some sort of
pinky grey, I think, is the official
pinky grey. You know, and so we pinky greys, we need to get together.
Now, does that mean that we're part of that we're partially the alien greys, or is there also alien pinks that we are part of?
Are we not men? We are Devo. Evolutionary development, Devo. That's what we are, and. Yeah, it's a horror, and let's wind up by saying that we're all people under the skin, and I see a problem. Actually, there is a little point that I'm going to make, and you can make a little point too if you want to, but we won't have any time to go off into a private room and chat if we don't wind up soon, and that is Erich Fromm the great Erich Fromm, who in 1941 published a book called Escape from Freedom, in which he says there's a problem, which is that people do not develop a self. They rely upon the approval of outsiders. So they do things to be, nothing more than something they live up to, as Bob Dylan put it, I believe. And he was Jewish too, still is, apparently. That there is no self developed. And so maturity is a process of developing a self. And in reading his books, I worked out something else. He points out that narcissism, and he is the man who defined narcissism. What we call malignant narcissism is the narcissistic personality disorder. He defined it in 1964 in a book called The Heart of Man. But people don't necessarily get there's this word malignant in front, and that benign narcissism is actually the normal condition of most human beings, that they seek approval. They want to have a better car because they want to keep up with the Joneses. They want others, they're snobby about what they wear, about what they eat, about what they do. And snobby can be inverted. It can be like, I drink the same beer as my dad drank. It's belonging to your tribe and not actually going, well, actually, I don't like this beer. I've got gluten intolerance. It's bad for me. So I'm going to drink French wine instead.
Or beer just as horribly tasting liquid that looks like somebody else drank it first.
Exactly. Absolutely horrible. But he is therefore saying that about 2/3 of the human population are caught in this, authoritarian trap of doing what they're meant to do and just going with the flow and fitting in with the people around them. And we have to grow up. That's an adolescent thing. It's exactly what you said. Teenagers do this. And we live in a society with consumerism, which seeks to impose this on everybody. We want you to be obedient. We want you to do what we think. And it's stifling and murdering the planet. It's destroying the resources for our children and grandchildren because we live on a planet that's run by very stable geniuses who don't realize that the genius has actually bolted from the stable. And, here we are with, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Abe, Modi, wherever you go, Scott Morrison, these domination leaders, these people who are authoritarian and push people around, rather than prestige leaders, as they're now being called, like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who actually seem to care about other human beings. They're not just listening to the spin doctor and saying the thing that will get them the most votes. They actually embrace people, physically and actually, though not so much with the COVID-19. But they seem to be human beings with empathy, rather than these half-wit robots who are trying to teach us to loathe and detest some aspect of the population. Whether it be the scroungers on the dole or, the criminals who are doing this, that, and the other. They want us to hate people. They want that to be part of what's going on. And hatred is the dispensing of existence. That's the end of my little sermon. If there's anything you'd like to add to it?
Well, just to pick up on that point, and, there are, as you said, there are areas we could go off into that we don't have time for right now. But hatred, as others have pointed out, and as you and I have talked about on many occasions, is a way of manipulating a group of people and controlling them. Because once you create an enemy, you create the need to be cohesive in order to protect one another, as well as yourselves, from that other, whatever it is. So as long as you have an enemy, you can't afford to leave the group. You have this clique you're a part of, and it really does boil down to better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Once you take away the hatred, you take away the need to stay with these sometimes hateful people who are generating loathing and disgust and hatred for other human beings simply because they're different.
I've often added...
Don't matter.
I'm sorry?
Different in ways that don't really matter.
Yeah. I've often, we talk about guilt induction and we talk about phobia induction, and I always add aversion, that you make somebody, they'll actually feel physically disgusted by their foodstuffs or their clothing or the music. When you see people talking about rock and roll and how it was going to pervert the whole society, or talking about cannabis and how it was going to pervert the whole society. Cannabis was banned in Canada in 1924, which is what started in the Western world, because of one book, a novel, which said that white women would start breeding with black men. And the Canadian Parliament decided they didn't want any of that. And it's sort of, well, okay, what's wrong with you? It doesn't. And now it's legal in Canada. There's a turnaround, isn't it? But yes. Yeah, so thank you very, very much indeed. I've found this very interesting.
It's a big subject, and I'm sure more that we can do with it at another time. But to me, it's really important because when I started 47 years ago,
40,000 years ago.
It seems like 1,000 years ago. Yes, when I started, it was the most extreme groups where you looked for this tendency to assign the right to exist or to refuse the right to exist to certain people. It was an oddity. And, we were all shocked by Jonestown. Everybody was shocked by Jonestown.
Yes.
We've come a long way from that, and more groups feel that it's right, metaphorically, to say these people are as good as not having a right to exist, but then to carry further. 47 years ago, we didn't have kids going into schools, shooting up schools. We didn't have people doing that kind of stuff. The only place we had it was in America, at least, was amongst racists.
Yeah.
Going and burning churches, because they had black people in them.
Yep.
Or attacking synagogues because they had Jewish people in them.
Yep.
Now it seems like people have a much lower threshold before they decide you don't have a right to exist anymore. I have a right to stand still on the sidewalk and shoot you because you're carrying a tin of soda and a packet of crisps.
Yeah.
Or I have a right to shoot you because you're jogging in your own neighborhood.
Yeah.
And that didn't used to be quite so bad.
No,
South or certain parts of America where lynchings were the norm almost. I think of Emmett Till and all the rest of that.
The closest that America got to being great was probably in the 1970s, where the civil rights movement had made great gains, and reforms were going on. And I don't like to say it, but Ronald Reagan, Reaganomics took the brakes off and allowed. And we're still in this. This is really going off the subject, but there still is the guy who ran Lehman Brothers, who instructed on video, and I've seen the film, who instructed his people they had to rip the hearts out of their clients while they were still beating and sell them subprime mortgages that were worthless. And therefore, with Goldman Sachs and a few others, collapsed the economy of the world very nearly. Now, the guy that did that, his punishment was he's now running exactly the same kind of corporation and nothing happened. There's been no regulation. Subprime's being sold again, and it will happen again. And that's because of cacocracy, the rule of the worst people, not just plutocracy, the rule of the rich, which has sadly always been the case in most parts of the world and is definitely the case in America today. On Democrats and libtards and reptards on either side, they're rich people. And so I'd like to see that change. I'd like to see people who actually care about other human beings, the government by the people, of the people, for the people, as a Republican president once said. And a president, by the way, even President Trump acknowledges is greater than himself, which is, I think, the only time he's ever acknowledged anybody is Abraham Lincoln. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, Christian. And we'll get together and talk about other things and more about this very soon indeed. Thanks a lot. I've been John Atack.
And I am still Christian Schurka.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
There should be statues of me.